Let's take our scriptures, and I've got a short time to cover a lot of ground. To 1 Samuel chapter 17. 1 Samuel 17. This is an amazing story, and I'm going to read it, not all of it, but I'm going to read a lot of it to you, and you follow along. The story is longer than we have time to read. But let's begin with verse 1 of 1 Samuel 17. Now the Philistines gathered their armies for battle, and they were gathered at Succoth, which belongs to Judah, and encamped between Succoth and Azekah in Ephes-dammim. Saul and the Israelites gathered and encamped at the valley of Elah, and formed ranks against the Philistines. The Philistines stood on the mountain on one side, and Israel stood on the mountain on the other side, with a valley between them. And there came out from the camp of the Philistines a champion named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a helmet of bronze on his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail. The weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. He had greaves of bronze on his legs, and a javelin of bronze slung between his shoulders. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron. And his shield-bearer went before him. He stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why have you come out to draw up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and are you not the servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves, and let him come down to me. If he's able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us." And the Philistines said, "Today I defy the ranks of Israel. Give me a man that we may fight together." When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. And move to verse 32. David said to Saul, "Let no one's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine." Saul said to David, "You're not able to go against the Philistine to fight with him, for you are just a boy, and he has been a warrior from his youth." But David said to Saul, "Your servant used to keep sheep for his father, and whenever a lion or a bear came and took a lamb from the flock, I went after it and struck it down, rescuing the lamb from its mouth. And if it turned against me, I would catch it by the jaw, strike it down, and kill it. Your servant has killed both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, since he has defied the armies of the living God." David said, "The Lord who saved me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will save me from the hand of this Philistine." So Saul said to David, "Go, and may the Lord be with you." Now Saul clothed David with his armor. He put a bronze helmet on his head and clothed him with a coat of mail. David strapped Saul's sword over the armor and tried in vain to walk, for he was not used to them. Then David said to Saul, "I cannot walk with these, for I'm not used to them." So David removed them. Then he took his staff in his hand and chose 5 smooth stones from the wadi and put them in his shepherd's bag, in the pouch. His sling was in his hand, and he drew near to the Philistine. The Philistine came on and drew near to David with his shield-bearer in front of him. When the Philistines looked and saw David, he disdained him, for he was only a youth, ruddy and handsome in appearance. The Philistine said to David, "Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks?" And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. The Philistine said to David, "Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and to the wild animals of the field." But David said to the Philistine, "You come to me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This very day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. And I will give the dead bodies of the Philistine army this very day to the birds of the air and to the wild animals of the earth, so that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel." and that all this assembly may know that the Lord does not save by sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand." When the Philistine drew nearer to meet David, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine. David put his hand in his bag, took out a stone and slung it, and struck the Philistine on his forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell face down on the ground. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, striking down the Philistine and killing him. There was no sword in David's hand. Then David ran and stood with the Philistine, grasped his sword, drew it out of its sheath, and killed him, then cut off his head with it. When the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. This is God's word. I want to begin with a quote. I think we have it for the screen. Chris, let's go ahead and show that. "Sometimes fear does not subside, and we must choose to do it afraid." What do you think about that? Sometimes fear does not subside, and we must choose to do it afraid. I wonder when the last time you were really frightened. Now, I know we're not supposed to be scared. We're not supposed to let fear be a part of our lives, but I wonder when that was true of you. When was the last time you were really afraid? I could tell you about breaking my leg in the wilderness and not having any cell phone coverage and laying on the ground for 2 days waiting to be rescued. I could tell you about the bully of our school, the thug, who came to me one time, or came to my brother one time and told him that he was going to kill me because I was dating his former girlfriend in high school. I could tell you about a time in the Alpine caves down in the Sangre de Cristos when I had a panic attack and I was inside the caves 300 feet from the entrance. I could also tell you about a time when I took 7 people up Broken Hand Mountain and got caught in a summer storm and we all nearly died of hypothermia. But one of the most frightening moments of my life was far more pedestrian than any of those. About 15 years ago, I had been out of ministry for a couple of years to rebuild and restore my marriage, and I dared to attempt to interview to be a pastor again down in Alamosa, Colorado. I flew here from the Northwest and stayed with my father down in Poncha Springs, and early on a Saturday morning, I drove the hour and a half down towards Alamosa, and the closer I got to Alamosa, the faster my heart began to beat. I got to a coffee shop in Alamosa to just kind of wait for the time to come. And as I was sitting there in that coffee shop, I started getting more afraid and more afraid and more afraid. My legs began to bounce. My tongue got so dry I could not make spit to talk, which is really a challenge in an interview. I felt as if I couldn't breathe, like a piano was sitting on my chest. And I began to hear these thoughts come into my head, and it was just the devil that come to me. And he said to me, "You're all washed up. They're going to reject you. You do not belong in ministry. If you get into ministry again, it will destroy your marriage. You are worthless. God is finished with you." And all of these thoughts were swirling around like dust motes in my mind. And I felt like I was waiting for my execution. I was so scared. And then I remember hearing this thought in my head. "Why are you so afraid, son?" And I assumed it was the Lord. And I said, "Because I don't want to be rejected." And he said, "By whom?" And I said, "That little church, this little church." And then he said, "But you're my son." I know. I got up, I walked out of the coffee shop, took a deep breath of that crisp Colorado air, and went to the interview with those words in my ear. "You are my son." Now, to shorten the story, the interview went really well. And they wanted to continue a conversation about me being their pastor. I got on a plane and flew back to the Northwest, and Lynette and I prayed, and we finally came to the conclusion that the best thing for our family was for me to withdraw my name as possible pastor of that church. And so I did. And it was the right decision, looking back on it. But I will never forget how frightened I was right before that interview. You ever been frightened like that? Or frightened to a degree like that? You know, fear is a big issue. In fact, do you know what the top fears in America are? I do, and you're going to learn them right now. Let's see about these. Top fears. Number 10 is the fear of commitment. And that's true of some of you. That's a joke. Number 9 is the fear of spiders. How many of you have this one? Fear of spiders. Okay, one of you. All right. Number 8 is the fear of rejection. Oh, that's mine. How about any of you? There's several of us in here. All right. What's number 7? Fear of failure. All right. That could be true of some of us in the room. Number 6, fear of death. Yeah, fear of death. Number 5, fear of intimacy. Number 4, fear of dark. The fear of the dark. Number 3, fear of heights. How many of you have that one? All right. Number 2, fear of flying. Who's here afraid of flying? Okay, Shirley is. All right. A couple of you are. And the number 1, wait a minute, don't put it up here. What's the number 1 fear? All right, number 1 fear is fear of public speaking. How many of you have that one? All right, now let me get this straight. According to this list and according to what you voted, some of you would rather die than do what I'm doing today. Is that right? Fear of public speaking, fear of death is number 6, and fear of fear of public speaking. You know, when I was in high school, the speech teacher told us that if you're nervous before you speak, just imagine your audience in their underwear. I want you to know, as your pastor, I have never done that, and I never will do that. But fears can be a very real thing. That's absolutely true about a lot of us. Being intimidated by an audience or an interview process or scared of a spider or battling the fear of rejection, all of those can be debilitating. They can cause us to freeze up, and they can destroy a lot of the joy that we have in our life. And it can also cause us to make poor decisions. So what do you do when you're faced with an overwhelming fear? Thus brings us to the story of David and Goliath, one of the most intimidating characters in all of the Old Testament. The entire army of Israel is scared to death of this guy. Now, this story is 3,000 years old. You've heard it so many times. You've seen it depicted in flannel graphs. You've probably seen movies about it. And because it's so familiar to us, we can sometimes overlook a lot of the things that really might teach us today. But you don't have to be raised in church to be familiar with this story. You can hear it referenced, as a sportscaster will say, to this underdog team that's trying to win against this very powerful team, that we have a David and Goliath situation. And so you can hear it, you can see it depicted in TV shows and on movies. It is a popular story in our culture. Well, what could we possibly learn from this story that we don't already know? And I think we could learn quite a little bit. Now, the popular moral of this story, the Aesop's fable moral of this story is, you can face your giants if you just summon some courage. It is a story about the power of the underdog. But if we listen to this story a little more deeply, we start to wonder, is this story about us, or is this a story about God? If it's a story about David, then it's a story about us. But if it's a story about God, then it's a different kind of thing. If you draw from this story that the main lesson that you can face down your giant, you will either be inspired to go back out these doors and really give it another go, or you will look at your giant as so overwhelming that you'll feel despair. But here's one thing that won't happen. You won't be transformed. Because this story is about people who can't face their giants. That's what this story is really about. And if truth were known, I really can't face mine either. So I want to invite you to go to the Valley of Elah with me, and let's just walk through this story. I'm going to try to hurry as fast as I can to get us to this place where we can face our giants. Now, these measurements that I read to you a moment ago are lost in translation. I don't know how many of you know how much a shekel weighs, but it's kind of hard to translate it in today's language and how tall, how far a cubit is. But let me give you some ideas of how big this guy was. He was 9 foot 9 inches tall. 9 foot 9 inches tall, which would have put him closer to 400 and something pounds also. If you add to his height the length of his arms when he would lift them over his head, you can imagine how imposing this creature was. But it wasn't just his size that was so intimidating to all of the armies of Israel. His coat of mail would have weighed between 175 and 200 pounds. That's a whole person. The spearhead that he had at the end of a javelin would have weighed between 20 and 25 pounds. Just the head of his spear. And then it says that, it tells us that he had a technological advantage. If you look in verse 7, and you'll see it there, in verse 7 it says his spearhead weighed 600 shekels of what kind of metal? Iron. Okay. Now the children of Israel all had Bronze Age weaponry, but the Philistines were one of the first groups of people to have Iron Age weaponry. This is a huge technological advance. In addition to these details, the writer mentions the number 6 many times as he describes the armor of this giant. And that number 6, as you probably know, was very important to the Hebrews. It was a symbolic number that meant it was attached to evil. Not only that, look at verse 5. In verse 5, he had a bronze helmet on his head, and he was clothed, and the New American Standard Version and some of the other versions says he was clothed with scale armor. He was clothed with scale armor. And the writer used the same language to describe the skin of a serpent. Now, when you put all of this together, it wasn't just his size. It wasn't just his weaponry. This is a serpent. And it dials up that imagery of what happened in the Garden of Eden when Adam and Eve were seduced to sin. This is the embodiment of evil. Everything evil and sinister and dark in this world. That's who this was standing before the armies of Israel. Goliath is a symbol of evil and darkness. He's everything bleak and sinister and destructive that you and I fear when we turn on our news or look in the mirror. Look at verse 8. Why have you come out to draw up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and are you not servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, you shall be our servants and serve us. Now, if you fast forward to the end of the story, David engages Goliath in battle, and we see a fascinating detail. So look at verse 49. David put his hand in his bag and took out a stone and slung it and struck the Philistine on the forehead, and the stone sank deep in his forehead, and he fell face down on the ground. Did you see that? He fell face down on the ground. Now, I'm not a forensic scientist, but it seems to me that if a stone was coming from this direction and hit you in the forehead, which direction might you fall? Backwards, but he falls face down. Very interesting, because this word face down is a Hebrew word, and it's the same word to use to describe the act of serving someone. It was the same Hebrew word used to describe someone who was in worship. And really, when you boil this story down, that's really what it's all about. Who will you wind up serving? Will you serve your fear, or will you serve your Father? When you read the entire chapter, this gets dialed in even a little tighter. There's an entire section where David is arguing with his older brother whether or not he should even go down and fight Goliath. And when you pay attention to this conversation between the brothers and Saul, they're all Goliath-centered. David is the only one in the story that is God-centered. Everybody else is thinking about how big Goliath is and how intimidating he is, but David is thinking about how big God is. Only David managed to see God. And so the question that rises to the surface like cream over a bucket of milk for me is this: what dominates the way you see your world and your life? Is it fear, or is it God? I saw a quote on a coffee shop one time that said this: fear knocked on the door, Faith answered, and no one was there. What are your Goliath fears in your life right now? When you go out the doors and you get in your car and you wipe off the snow and you kind of go down the road a little bit, what's the rap knocking on the door that keeps you up at night? That makes your tongue go dry and your heart race? How are you going to approach this? Goliath-centered or God-centered? Enter this champion. You see it in verse 4. There came out from the camp of the Philistines a champion named Goliath. The word champion is a Hebrew word that means man in between. It's used to describe someone who's a representative fighter. It was a common way of doing battle in those days. Rather than everyone engaging in battle, you would select a representative. And the champion is a brother of the tribe, often the captain of the army, and sometimes even the king. And he would come down and he would fight on behalf of his people. And whoever won would then win the day. Now, who should be Israel's champion, Helen? Saul should be Israel's champion. We already went through this on Wednesday night. But where is Saul? Saul is in his tent doing his best imitation of Don Knotts. He is scared out of his mind. He should be the one. He is head and shoulders above everybody else in Israel. We've already found this out. He should be the warrior king that's out there. The captain, the king, the brother of all the brothers. But he's scared. He's not out there. And so here comes David, the least of his brothers, the run of the litter. He comes out to face the Goliath as the captain of his people now, and eventually he would become king. And the writer very deliberately kind of slows down the action of this story so that we can hear of a conversation between Goliath and David and Saul and David and his brothers. And the question is, how will David win this battle? Will he win ultimately with weaponry? The answer is no. David will ultimately win with weakness. And this is the huge meta-narrative message that God is sending through this story. David will win through weakness. In fact, he says, I only come here, we see it in verse 45, you come here with a sword and a spear. I come really in the name of the Lord of hosts. That's all I've got. God uses the vulnerability of this teenage boy to fight a 9-foot Goliath to demonstrate the ways and means of living a with God life. David wins through weakness, and by doing so, it's as if the entire Israelite army won. They are treated as if David's victory is their victory. And by extension from there, all of Israel received the victory that David secured in the bottom of the valley of Elah that day. Now, this ought to sound familiar to some of you. This is a 3,000-year-old story that pictures what happened on Calvary with the Son of David. And the Son of David, Jesus Christ, in weakness, conquered the giants that have plagued mankind since the Garden of Eden. The giants of sin and death. And Jesus did this not at the risk of his life, but at the cost of his life. He won the victory through weakness. And his victory is ours. The writer of Hebrews said it very, very well. I want to ask you to read this with me. In Hebrews chapter 2 it says, it was fitting that God, for whom and through whom all things exist, in bringing many children to glory, should make the pioneer of their salvation perfect through sufferings. Since therefore the children share flesh and blood, he himself likewise shared the same things, so that through death he might destroy the one who has the power of death, that is, the devil, and free those who all their lives were held in slavery by the fear of death. That's a dense passage. But the author uses a language in the verses that were preceding this. He calls this person the pioneer of our faith. The pioneer. of their salvation. The Greek word for pioneer is a word archegos, and it's a word that means champion. It's a word that means captain, a person who fights in a representative combat on behalf of everyone else. That's what the writer of Hebrews is telling us. He's telling us that God took on human form in the person of Jesus, our brother, our captain, and our king. And by dying on the cross in weakness, God defeats our old nemesis of sin and death. I found a poem this week by Eugene Peterson. I want to put it before you. I found it in a book of his, and it's called Smooth Stones. David, who chose 5 smooth stones from the brook. Now watch this. Odd-shaped pebbles roll and tumble around the rock, which smooths them into 5 smooth stones, one of which will kill a giant. Isn't that good? Don't you see that until you and I build our life on the good news that Jesus has fought the ultimate giants of sin and death for us, we will never be able to face our Goliaths in this world. Think about the giant of failure. And some of us in this room struggle with this. We fear failure. You can try to make yourself brave as you face whatever situation is confronting you, and that could be a marriage that is not nearly what you let everybody else think it is. It could be a home life that is filled with trouble. It could be a future that you're uncertain about. But it is only when you and I have this bedrock assurance that no failure in this life can separate us from the love of God, which is in Christ Jesus our Lord. It is only with that assurance that I can face down the fear of failure in my life, because God is with me. Or as the author Tim Keller has put it, if I have the smile of God, all other frowns are inconsequential. Think about the fear of suffering. You can't really have courage to defeat suffering until at the very center of your life, down deep inside where the knobs are, there is a knowledge that Jesus has suffered also, and that God actually entered our suffering when Jesus came into this world. And that there's no suffering that you and I can go through physically, emotionally, spiritually, relationally, that God does not know something about in the person of Jesus. Sometimes fear does not subside, and we must choose to do the thing afraid. At the end of I was telling my friend Micah, who's visiting with us this week, that I'm going to share a story from the Lord of the Rings, and I don't know why I do this, because only 2 or 3 of you have ever read the book or watched the movies, but this mainly is probably for me. But so just imagine the scene if you can. It's one of the most powerful scenes at the end of the first movie, The Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Rings, and it's about Boromir. Boromir is the son of the steward of Gondor. Boromir is a man, and he wants to be king of Gondor so badly when his father passes away. And he knows that the only way he's going to ever be able to do that is if he takes the one powerful ring that Frodo, this little hobbit, this little David character, is carrying. Frodo's carrying this ring that rules all rings and is the most powerful thing on the planet. And Boromir wants that to take back to Gondor so he can rule with justice and strength and win the day. And he tries to take it from Frodo. And in that process of wrestling around with Frodo, Frodo puts the ring on and disappears. And when he disappears, then it becomes clear to Boromir that he had failed in his ability to resist the temptation and the seduction of the power of the ring. And he feels horrible. He feels shame. And then the orcs and the goblins come and they start to attack the other little hobbits, Merry and Pippin there. And Boromir becomes this heroic person and fights off one orc and goblin after another. And they just start stacking up like cordwood all around him. And he's just being filled with arrows, dying. But he saves the hobbits. And then Aragorn, who is the true king, the once and future king of Middle-earth, comes to his rescue and drives off all of the enemy around and wins the day, and then kneels down beside fallen Boromir and kind of nourishes him and cares for him as he dies. And the last words on Boromir's lips were, "I would have followed you, my brother, my captain, and my king." I'm telling you something, ladies and gentlemen. Number one, giants are real. They're real. And you can't face them. The only way to face them is with the voice of your Father ringing in your ear. But you're my son. And with the voice of God reminding you who you are, you can win the day, because the battle belongs to whom? The Lord, who is your brother and your captain and your king. Let's pray together.